Today we're talking about the outline, and I, for one, want to say don't let this stage freak you out. It's actually very simple. This English 122 outline handout, if we were in a physical classroom, I would hand this to you. The first page of this goes through the logic of what goes in there, and the second page is a worksheet that you could start filling out by hand. However, what you turn in is a Microsoft Word document with the outline, not the worksheet. And I'll show you how to do some of the formatting here when we get towards the end. But let's go over what's expected in the outline assignment. So by now, you should have read all of your research, figured out what claims you're going to talk about. You should have turned in your annotated bibliography, and you're ready to write your outline because you know what all your research has said. If you don't, you're going to have to do that, and rather quickly, to build your outline. So the outline that I'm showing you is a basic format for academic papers. No matter what the length, the paper should follow the format of having an introduction, body, and conclusion. Read over what typically goes in each section of the paper, and then use the worksheet as the handout for your specific paper, sort of as your rough draft, as you're brainstorming. The introduction should have some of the following elements depending on the type of paper. Start with an attention grabber, a short story, example, statistic, historical context that introduces the paper topic. Remember, we talked about techniques for introductions. That's what I want you to use, is one of those techniques that we discussed earlier in the semester. If you think back to the article by Gillum and Wooden, their attention grabber that's part of their introduction breaks down the opening of cars. And so the first two paragraphs, one is a regular size, and then the second paragraph is actually very small. They're really just to get our attention and to focus our attention on what their topic is going to be. Your introduction should also give an overview of any issues involved with the subject. So in other words, you're providing context for the reader. What does a reader need to know to understand your topic? You may need to define key terminology needed to understand the topic. Again, that's all about providing context. You can quote or paraphrase sources revealing the controversial nature of the subject. So if you think back to some of the other things we've written, that's part of contextualizing your own argument, is figuring out what the other side or what different sources have to say on the particular topic. You may need to highlight background information on the topic that the reader needs to understand. We do not have page numbers for the Gillum and Wooden essay, but that third paragraph that Gillum and Wooden wrote, where it says, some people have looked at how females are portrayed in Disney movies, and then other people have said this, and they provide basically a synthesis of the sources who've written about gender in Disney movies. That kind of synthesis helps to put your ideas or your argument in context. So it doesn't have to be exactly like our Hermit Crab academic essay, but it does need to provide context of what sources, credible sources, are saying about the topic that you're going to be entering in conversation with. The introduction must end with a thesis statement. The thesis statement, this is a longer paper, so it may be 1 to 2 pages in length. It's an umbrella statement. So your thesis tells us what the overall paper will focus on and briefly outline the main points in the paper. And Gillum and Wooden are a great example for that, because they tell us that they're going to be talking about how the new male model in Disney Pixar movies is impacting young males. That's the point. Like, you don't have to, in Comp 1 in particular, we sometimes have a thesis that's A plus B plus C equals whatever the thesis is. But this one, you've got a much larger paper, so you're giving an umbrella statement that covers the whole topic that you're going to be discussing. The body of the paragraph, or the body paragraphs, should clearly present the main points of the paper as listed in the thesis. So if you say you're going to be talking about something, you may have 3 different sections that you're going to talk about, like historical viewpoints, or viewpoint A, viewpoint B, and then viewpoint C, which is where you land as far as the argument goes. But then the body of the paragraph is where you put that thesis statement to life. That thesis statement is your organizational tool, and your body should follow that organizational tool. Make sure that you're giving strong examples, details, and explanations to support your main points. Don't simply restate. You introduce your quote, you give the quote, then you explain what that quote means, and then explain how you're using it in your particular argument. So yes, this is an argumentative paper, so you need to address any counter arguments or refute those arguments. In other words, make a concession to the other side. Say, for instance, Gilliam and Wooden talk about the fact that in the early versions of Disney animated classics, the male protagonist was Prince Charming. I didn't even know he had an actual, each of the Prince Charming has their own name until I had kids. And that what they say kind of as a concession is, he was very two-dimensional before, in the early version of Disney classics. So maybe it was important that, maybe it wasn't important that anybody evaluate him because he was very two-dimensional. So you would make a concession and then your counter-argument, and their counter-argument is, Disney has definitely changed, our times have changed, and it's time to look at the way men are portrayed in Disney movies. Disney animated classics, really, is what they're talking about. If a research paper used strong evidence from your sources, paraphrases, summaries, and quotations that support the main points. Hopefully, as you were filling out your annotated bibliography worksheets, you were able to pull down those main points. So now those worksheets become your notes for completing your paper. Once you've come and listed all of your main points, then you're going to write your conclusion. And remember, I've said before, if you can get away with it, depending on your personal writing style, if you can write the body paragraphs first, it makes it so much easier to write an introduction because you know what you've said, and then you can write a compelling introduction to what you've already said, and then write the conclusion. So yes, you're going to restate your thesis from the introduction. Don't use the same words. Don't use it, don't try and write that one sentence conclusion because that's not going to cut it. You're going to briefly summarize the main points found in the body of the paper. I would say don't go over 2 sentences for each point because then you're just relitigating your argument. Give a statement of the consequences of not embracing the position. So if you're writing an argumentative paper, so like my student who wrote about restricting gun ownership for senior citizens, the consequences could be death. I mean, there are legitimate studies that have been done and unfortunately tragedies that happen in families where a senior citizen has shot somebody in the family because they thought it was an intruder. So make sure that you're explicit on what happens if we don't change whatever it is you're wanting to change in your argument or don't embrace your particular argument. And then end with a strong clincher statements. In other words, give the reader the so what. So this here could be an appropriate, meaningful final sentence that ties the whole point of the paper together. It can refer back to the attention grabber. Remember, we have that echoing the introduction is one of the conclusion techniques we talked about earlier this semester. Try and use one of those. I want you to experiment and really increase your writing skill by trying some of these things. So here's some tips as you're writing down, as you're filling out the worksheet or typing up your outline. Decide on your thesis and your main points first. You don't need to start writing your paper with the introduction, which I've already said. Try writing the thesis and body first, then go back and figure out how to best introduce the body and conclude the paper. Use transitions between main points and between examples within the main points. Always keep your thesis in the forefront of your mind while writing. Everything in your paper must point back to the thesis. So in other words, if it's not one of your topics, either change your outline or your thesis or delete it out of the paper, depending on the focus. Use the back of this handout or page 2 of this handout to start brainstorming an outline, which we're going to do here in a bit. And your final outline must be an alphanumeric outline. There's a link to Purdue OWL where they show what that looks like. I'm going to give you an example of how to write one, but first I want to go over the worksheet because this is where you start brainstorming. A lot of times students just want to sit at the computer and type, but it's important that you give yourself a chance to kind of play with the best way to organize your ideas. And so if you handwrite it, usually there's a mental shift and you feel more able to change it than once you type it out. But however you fill out the worksheet is fine. Think about some ways that you might introduce it. So what kind of attention grabber you can use. Think back to the type of introductions we discussed earlier this semester that you may want to use. And then come up with a working thesis statement. So remember on the topic exploration, I said it had to be in the form of a question. Now you have a thesis that essentially answers that question. It's usually the last sentence or sentences in the introduction. You can have multiple paragraph introductions, but make sure your thesis statement is the last sentence in that introduction, no matter how many paragraphs you have. I've given you in the worksheet 4 different main points. You may have more, you may have less. It's just to show you it's not like it's a 6 to 8 page paper. So a 5-paragraph essay is probably not going to cut it for this. So we have multiple main points that we're going to talk about, and then start writing down what examples, details, and explanations you are going to use to prove that particular point. And so that's where you use the notes that you've taken either on your own or in the annotated bibliography worksheet, and you start figuring it out. Be careful that this doesn't become about source A says this in one paragraph and source B says this in another paragraph, because what you want to do is figure out what your point is first and then pull in examples from multiple sources as in regards to that particular topic. So you should have multiple main points, multiple examples. Remember to sandwich your quotes. So you introduce the topic in a topic sentence, the first sentence of every paragraph. Then you make your point, introduce a quote or a summary or a paraphrase, explain or give it. If it's a direct quote, then put that in there and then explain it. Don't assume that the reader's tracking with you, that we think the way you do. Explain how you interpret that particular quote, and then transition to another example or transition to the next paragraph. And then finally, in your conclusion, you can reword your thesis. And then what are you going to do to give us the clincher, that so what moment? Why does the reader care? Make sure that you leave the reader thinking. And you can ask questions, you can use quotes. There's all kinds of rhetorical techniques we talked about earlier in the semester that you can use. All right, so how do you format all this lovely stuff? Let Microsoft do the hard work, is what I'm going to say. Every teacher is probably going to have a different idea about outlining. And if you look at the example in Purdue OWL, you'll see that there's a specific order of, Roman numeral ABC 1, 2, 3. There's a specific order. And I am for that if you want to practice that. But I'm also for letting the software do what it was designed to do, which is make this easier. Now notice if I just do the Roman numerals, it's not really doing it for me. I'm just typing, sort of like talking out loud. I'm just really typing characters. It's not really seen as an outline. Look what happens then when I change the formatting. And in the paragraph grouping, so in the Home tab, the paragraph grouping, there are different ways that you can create an outline. Bullet points are not formal outline material, and same if it's just 1, 2, 3. If you're making a list, 1, 2, 3 works, but otherwise it's not so great. So we're going to go with the multi-level list. And it has multiple options. I have a preference for starting with the Roman numeral, so we're going to do that. Oops, let me back up and actually highlight everything so we can get all of them done the same way. And we're going to go to this one that shows a start with Roman numerals. Now it did change the font type, and I'm going to want you to change out the font to Times New Roman. Let's go ahead and do that now just to make life easier on ourselves so we don't have to change it later. So it's Times New Roman 12. Now in the introduction, you can write down in your Oh, it's still not doing it. All right, well, hold on, because I'm going to figure out the formatting of this, because I don't want you guys... Oh, you know what? I'm probably used to doing this part on the Word version, and the Word version will automatically build in those subcategories when you start typing. So I don't even know how to demonstrate this on a Mac. But you're going to have your subheadings, and then you're going to end up in your... so you'd have an intro idea that might be A, and then you're going to have a thesis that might be B. So we're going to format them, but we're going to tab them over. Oh, see, no, we're not going to use this one. Let's try... Not a super fan. But again, I want the software to do the work for you. No, this isn't going to work for me. So obviously Mac is different with outlining than PC or Windows based. So usually you should be able to start with this one. And when you get to this, oh, there we go. I just didn't have it formatted rightly. Then you can do intro technique and thesis statement. And then the body, you're going to have idea A, oh. And why does it do it for one and not the other? So here, we'll just copy these over. I think when you guys are building them, they won't do this to you. I think this is a lovely Mac issue that I'm having. And so I'm just doing it this way. I have no idea why it was being so weird. So you'd have main point 1, point 2, point 3, and so on until you finished the main points that you're going to talk about in your paper. How you divide it out could be very different. Like say you have point 1, but then you have 3 different subpoints under that. That's fine. If you want to stop at A, that's also fine. What you can do is you're writing your outline to help it become a step towards making your rough draft is start putting in, like, if your main point is senior citizens have a higher rate of accidental injury for what they perceive as break-in. Say that's your main point. And then you could say author A says this, and then author B says this. Here's where I stand, except for you're not using I because this is an academic paper. And then reach a conclusion for that particular point. If you want to include and paste in some quotes that you want to use in that point, that's fine because make sure it's cited. But that's fine to do that because then it becomes a step towards creating your rough draft. But if you just want to use bullet points or just really short, concise phrases, that's also fine. So if I was going to say intro technique, thesis statement, point 1 is senior citizens, death, injury, prison, or whatever the different points are in this first point, that would be enough. But if you use a full sentence anywhere, you have to remain consistent and do full sentences everywhere. So I don't care if you use bullet points or not bullet points, but if you use short phrases or full sentences, but they need to stay consistent throughout the paper. In other words, if you're going to include your quotes and stuff so that the outline helps become your rough draft, then if you're going to include full sentence quotes, you're going to need all of your main points and all of your ideas to be in full sentences. The advantage of this is that you're slowly building your rough draft, so once you get rid of the weird formatting, you should be able to just turn that, to save that outline as rough draft and start writing your rough draft off of that source. And then make sure at the very end that you go through, because it changed the formatting, make sure it's Times New Roman 12. I think that the trouble I was having are because of Mac acts differently than a Windows-based. If you have trouble with this, you can just type these in and use tabs to create this. But in our campus computers, and that doesn't mean your computer is going to work like that, but they're Windows-based computers, and usually once you start typing the Roman numerals in the Windows-based, it starts building your outline. I think the problems I was having earlier were because I use a Mac. If you use a Mac, you understand that. There's always things are done differently. Okay, so that's what you need to know about outlines. It doesn't have to take you long. You're going to you're going to start pooling your ideas and figure out where you have main points that you want to discuss, and then just start to organize them. I don't want this to take a long time. I want you to spend more time writing a rough draft. The worksheet is there to help you. You can use it, but you are not required to use it. Oh, interesting. On my sample. So the worksheet is there for your benefit, but you're not, well, you can use this. Actually, I was just realizing you can use the worksheet, like save it and delete all this other stuff, delete the underlines, and just type in the information that goes under there, and that would qualify as your outline. You do need the name block and the header information, and what I'm looking for is that you have enough information to write a 6 to 8 page paper on. It's easier to find out early if you don't have enough information, so you can start figuring out what other topics or subtopics can I discuss to make sure I'm covering the topic fully and meeting the page requirements. There's nothing more frustrating than getting to 4.5 pages and then realizing you have nothing else to say, but a 4.5 page paper is probably not going to be a passing paper. So the earlier you work on your outline, the better it is. Now's a great time to ask me questions.